The Hebrew word of the day is rachum, mercy. The prophet Jeremiah wrote that God's mercies never cease toward his followers, and they are new every morning. The word mercy used in this verse is the Hebrew word rachum, or racham, which means to actively show compassion. According to this verse, God actively shows compassion toward us every morning. Ancient believers used to think that every night while they slept, their souls went back to God to be close to the Creator and be given wisdom. Then God would return the souls to them every morning to begin a brand new day. While this is a great picture of God's compassion toward us, I know some of us find it hard to start a new day because we still carry the troubles of the previous day. Maybe you wake up feeling like you don't deserve God's compassion. Maybe you're like me and you wake up some mornings feeling like the bad things that happened in your past will overwhelm you in the day ahead. To this, my friend Anley Stanley says, there is an appropriate way to use your story, not as an excuse, but as a testimony to God's ability to free you from your past. That's God's mercy and compassion. That is his rachom. As the sun rises this morning, may you be aware of God's tangible compassion and mercy, his rachom, towards you. This was a reading from 52 Hebrew Words Every Christian Should Know by Dave Adamson, published by Christian Art Gifts. You can purchase this on Amazon, or you can contact Christian Art Gifts at their website. Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another episode of Coffee, the Bible and Page. I'm Page, your caffeine-imbued host. Here's my caffeine. Say it with me. You know the drill. In the beginning, coffee. And lo, it was very good. All right, we're continuing on. Chapter 3 of Romans. We're going to be looking at verses 9 to 19 today. Starting with part 1. Verse 9, privilege is not the same as immunity. What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all, for we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. Wait a minute. Didn't he just say in verses 1 and 2 that there's a great deal of advantage to being a Jew? And now he's saying there's no advantage? Paul, what are you talking about? Well, he's talking about two different things. Paul says the Jews do indeed have an advantage. They were trusted with the words of God. They were caretakers of the words of God. That does give them a privileged place, a privileged position in the panoply of humanity. But possession of the law and being caretaker of the law does not guarantee escaping the consequences of breaking that law. He says Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. In other words, having the light doesn't mean you've escaped the darkness. It just means you can see it more clearly. Israel wasn't wrong about being chosen. They were. They were wrong about what that meant. Chosen doesn't mean exempt. It means responsible. Responsibility without transformation leaves you under the same authority as everyone else, the authority of sin. And Paul pivots to the central theme of chapter 3 from that, which is who is righteous. Paul is saying here that regarding morality and righteousness, being Jewish has no cachet. All right, this is not a dismissal of Israel's historic role. It's not a denial that the Jews were entrusted with God's revelation. Paul has already acknowledged that privilege in verses 1 through 8. But privilege is not the same as immunity. And access to the truth is not the same as obedience to it. When the question is judgment standing before God or freedom from sin's dominion, there is no advantage possessed by either group. So Paul states plainly, without qualification, Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. Now, Paul uses a really powerful phrase here. under the power of sin. And the Greek kind of adds some punch to it. The word translated under, it's not talking about a physical location. It means under authority, under control. This is the language of submission, dominion. Then the word for sin, this isn't the things that we do. It's the things that make us do the things we do. It's something that rules. In Romans, Paul treats sin like a master, a tyrant, a power, a force that we are under the dominion of. Then there's the word sin. Okay, well, gosh. Again, sin is a tyrant. It's not an act here. It's a tyrant. And finally, the word to be. Paul's describing a condition of existence. In other words, Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. It's a continual, never-ending thing. It's not an event. It's just a state of existence. I'll put it all together. Paul isn't saying we occasionally sin. He's saying we live under the dominion of this power of sin, the tyrant called sin. This is important. Paul's not writing about isolated failures or moral lapses. Paul is writing about dominion. Sin is not merely something people commit, it is something under which they live. Humanity does not merely stumble into sin. It exists beneath its rule. We have to stop thinking about sin as just merely things that we do that are bad. Sin is a tyrant. It's a force to be reckoned with, and it controls humanity. Everyone, Jew and Gentile. This results in this conclusion that, well, there's none righteous. That's what he says in verses 10 through 12. Paul turns to Scripture and he makes a statement. There is none righteous. He has a series of statements that begin with the phrase, there is no. Verse 10, there's no one righteous, not one. Verse 11, there's no one who understands. There's no one who seeks God. Paul's explaining the horror of verse 9 when he wrote that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. This is a horror. This isn't an academic thing. It's a horrific reality. Humanity is all under the power of sin. And Paul emphasizes humanity's universal condition before God by highlighting a state of being in which people are neither righteous nor capable of true understanding or inclined to seek God. This is not merely a one-time failure, but an ongoing habitual reality. Paul underscores that this condition applies to everyone, Jew and Gentile. Taken together, these words paint a very clear picture. Nobody wants God. Not really. Well, that raises an obvious question. How can Paul make such an all-encompassing claim? Well, he supplies the reason immediately. He says, you ask me, how can this be? Look. Verse 12, he said, just look. All have turned away. They've together become worthless. See, this is the key. Humanity's condition is not ignorance, but rebellion. People are not unaware of God. They didn't just miss the fork in the path that takes you to God. They're resistant to God. They don't fail because they lack information, but because they reject submitting to Him. Turning away is a willful act. And Paul insists it's universal. Not some, not most, all. And he presses the point further with another absolute. There is no one who does good. Not even one. Again, the objection rises naturally. But people do good things, Paul. Well, Paul's not saying that they don't, but he's denying that anyone left to themselves consistently does good as God defines it, flowing from reverence, obedience, and love for Him. Apart from God, even our best deeds are compromised at the root. And he's going to get into that here in part 2. Stand by. All right, welcome back. Part 2. Starting with verse 13. Paul's been talking about the universality of the corruption of humanity. And to demonstrate this corruption, he catalogs the evidence. Verse 13, he says, their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. Most English translations say they practice deceit or they deceive, which is accurate. But it's not as complete a definition as the words actually mean in Greek. A fuller sense would be something like, with their tongues, they were continually deceiving. When Paul says, the throat is an open grave, he's quoting Psalms 5:9. When 5:9 goes, for there is no truth in their mouth, their inward part is destruction itself, their throat is an open grave, they flatter with their tongue. Paul isn't inventing vivid imagery. He's stringing together Israel's own scriptures to make his case. In the ancient Jewish imagination, a grave or a tomb symbolized death, decay, uncleanness, or the realm that is opposed to life. An open grave is worse than a sealed one. It exposes corruption. It emits death. It defiles anything that comes near. So when Paul, via the psalmist, says their throat is an open grave, he's saying what comes out of their mouth spreads death, corruption, and defilement, revealing their heart's true condition. Whew. In the Judaism of the first century, they believed that speech reveals the heart. The mouth is the overflow of one's inner reality. What you are comes out in your words. Jesus echoes this exact logic later when he said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Matthew 12. Paul is standing firmly inside this Jewish worldview here. Now, in the second half of verse 13 on, he starts to build something called a katina, which is a chain of quotations from the Psalms and prophets. His point is not that Gentiles are terrible or that Jews are terrible, but the scriptures themselves testify that all humanity stands under the power of sin. That's the shock. Paul's saying humanity was created to speak life. Instead, human speech produces death. This reveals a deeper problem than just simple bad behavior. It's a corrupted inner orientation, or the heart itself. That ongoing aspect is exactly what Paul wants the reader to feel. He's not saying sometimes they lie. He's saying they live in lies. Here are his words. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There's a progression here, and it's intentional. Paul moves from speech to action, from words to violence, from inner corruption to outward destruction. Sin infects every part of the human person. What we say, where we go, what we leave behind us. Wherever humanity moves apart from God, the trail is marked by ruin rather than peace. Think about it. Paul starts with the mouth because that's where the heart leaks out. He says our words carry poison. This poison originates in our hearts. Then he moves to the feet. We just don't speak destruction. We move towards it. We do it. Then he zooms out further and says, everywhere we go, we leave ruin behind us. And finally, he tells us why. It's because we don't even know the way of peace. This isn't a list of bad habits. This is a diagnosis of the human condition. From what we say, to what we do, to the path we walk, sin has its fingerprints all over it. Stand by in a moment. I'll be back with part 3. All right, welcome back. Part 3, verses 18 and 19 and onwards. Coffee's still good, by the way. All right, Paul has just wrapped up the totality of humanity's true condition. And he gathers all of this into one last devastating diagnosis. He says in verse 18, there's no fear of God before their eyes. In fact, that's the foundation of everything we've been talking about. This is why humanity is universally corrupt. There's no fear of God. That's the foundation of man. And that's the foundation of man's sin. This is the root of everything else. The absence of reverence for God explains the rejection of truth, the distortion of speech, the spread of violence, and the inability to walk in peace. Where there is no fear of God, there is no moral anchor, only self-rule. Why should they obey God if, in their eyes, God's rule has no value? This is where Paul brings us face to face with an uncomfortable truth. Humanity's problem is not that it is mistaken. It is that it is willful. People don't turn from God because they can't see him. They turn because they don't want him. Paul insists this condition is universal. Not some cultures, not certain eras. All of mankind. Our path toward God does not begin with self-improvement, moral comparison, or religious privilege. It begins with an honest recognition of this reality. Every human being stands guilty, exposed, and powerless under sin's rule. If Paul stopped there, there would be no hope for humanity. Only once that truth is fully faced and understood can the need for grace be properly understood. We'll become getting into that later. Let's look at verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Well, who's under the law? Paul's made it pretty clear up to now. Everybody. The law doesn't pertain just to the Jews. It pertains to everyone, Jew and Gentile. Everyone is under the law. Paul proved this in chapter 1 when discussing the Gentiles. Paul proved it in chapter 2 as pertaining to the Jews. Whew. Folks, you know, it's funny to me when I look at the world around us today and I see all this violent reaction against things of God. They're only proving this out. They're proving there is a God because they're getting angry at someone. They know who he is. Why would you get angry at something that doesn't exist? Right? So that's the humanity's general overall condition. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Stand by. Part 4 is coming up. All right, let's wrap up this portion of Romans 3. In verse 20, Paul gives a summation of mankind standing before God. He's leaving no brick unturned. No brick unturned? No stone unturned, I think is the right phrase. Verse 20 says, therefore, in other words, he's summarizing everything he just talked about. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. When Paul says, therefore, and he's making his closing argument. Remember that old saying? Whenever you see the word therefore, go back a little bit and you'll see what that word's there for. I know it's kind of cute, but that's what that pastor reminded me of. Paul now brings his long argument to a decisive and sobering conclusion. After leveling every distinction between Jews and Gentiles, religious privilege, pagan ignorance, he declares a universal truth. No one will be justified before God by works of the law. This is not merely a critique of Jewish law-keeping, nor is it an attack on moral effort in general. It's a sweeping verdict on the entire human race. No one does righteous. No one does any good. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous through the law. See, the law does not heal. The law reveals. The law, which many assumed would serve as a pathway to righteousness, is revealed instead as a mirror. By looking into this mirror, we see our true nature reflected at us. The problem is not the law itself. It's good. But it's just a mirror. That would be like us blaming a mirror because we look ugly. The mirror tells the truth. The problem lies in the human heart. Sin twists even God's good commands into instruments of self-deception and self-justification. In this way, the law functions diagnostically rather than redemptively. It cannot heal. It can only reveal the disease. Rather than declaring us righteous, the law renders us accountable. It strips away excuses, silences every defense, leaves all people, religious and irreligious, standing equally guilty before a holy God. We cannot ignore what this mirror shows us. This verse is especially devastating to religious confidence, possession of the law, knowledge of the law, even zeal for the law. Cannot justify anyone. Obedience, however sincere, cannot erase guilt already incurred. The law can tell us what righteousness looks like, but it cannot give us the power to become righteous. A mirror cannot make us beautiful. It simply tells us the truth about ourselves. Thus, Romans 3:20 does not close the door on hope, it closes the door on self-salvation. By reducing every human claim to righteousness to silence, Paul prepares the way for the revelation of a righteousness that is available to us, a righteousness that comes from God apart from the law, a righteousness received, not achieved. The law awakens the conscience to sin so that grace might awaken the sinner to life. Think about that. The law awakens the conscience to sin so that grace might awaken the sinner to life. Another way of saying this is to say that by proving the absolute depravity of all humanity, Paul is laying the foundation for this truth. God's grace is not one of several paths to heaven. It's the only path. And we'll see that as we continue. That's a good place to stop. I'm Paige. Here's my caffeine. Have a glorious day. I'm out of here. Bye-bye. Go to Amazon.com and do a search for my name, Paige Garwood, and you will find my Essays in Romans series. Each book is dedicated to a chapter of Romans and will contain the script of each podcast, plus thought-provoking questions at the end to help you with your studies. You have been watching or listening to Coffee, the Bible, and Paige with your host, Paige C. Garwood, thinking with his mouth open since Noah was tarring the ark.